Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity Project, a project based on the assertion that crime and law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. And I'm sitting down to have a conversation, my second conversation with Michael Liebowitz, who's very kindly taken the time to have a second conversation with me. I do think if someone's worth talking to, they're worth talking to twice. But I really appreciate Michael taking the time once again to have a conversation with me. I'll put a link to our previous conversation in the description. In that, we had a good old discussion about the is-ought gap and rights and morality and where our different perspectives as Michael's more of an objectivist and I'm more of a libertarian with regards to our perspective. Yeah, I wanted to sort of explore things and also other things that Michael has been experiencing in his own pursuit for liberty and a better world. Yeah, without further ado, I want to say thank you again to Michael for taking the time and hand over to you to introduce yourself.
Well, Michael Liebowitz, I host a podcast called The Rational Egoist. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. I've written a couple books, Down the Rabbit Hole, How the Culture of Corrections Encourages Crime, and View from a Cage, My Transformation from Convict to Crusader for Liberty. Those are both available on Amazon. And I'm also the vice chairperson for the American Capitalist Party. They can find that at americancapitalistparty.org and learn all about us. I don't know. That's it. That's all I got. But given this is the second interview, maybe with diminishing marginal utility, this interview is worth less than the last one, I suppose.
I guess so. Although one of the reasons why I'm always keen to speak to someone a second time is I always feel like our first conversation can stand as a good foundation for a second conversation, and obviously it's a good way that I had a good chance to kind of ruminate on things that we discussed before, and there's certainly areas I'd like to kind of go deeper with you on, asking your opinion on. But a couple of things I want to speak about is one of the big obvious differences between objectivists and libertarians from my perspective. And this might not be how objectivists would frame it, but from a libertarian perspective, objectivists are a little bit what we call minarchists with their approach to government. They think a little bit of government to do this very specific thing, is okay. And from a libertarian point of view, we feel like, it's not. So that's something I kind of wanted to get into more detail with you. But before we go into that, I wanted to also ask you, because you mentioned before we went on about some of the things that you've been thinking about lately with regards to the culture, and the way people kind of disagree online and discourse and stuff like that. So perhaps we could talk a little bit about that, and then we can show them how it should be done with regards to how we explore our disagreements.
Oh, okay. I want to just say,
Yeah.
so libertarians aren't all anarchists. That's the first thing. In that, while objectivists are not anarchists, although there are anarchists who claim to be objectivists, but they reject an entire pillar of Ayn Rand's philosophy by doing so. So I don't know how they can still be objectivists, but the main thing is libertarians start at politics with, and again, it's not all libertarians, but the libertarians that are that invoke the non-aggression principle, for instance, start at politics with self-ownership. Whereas objectivism, we start at metaphysics, go through epistemology, then through ethics, and then get to politics. So that would be the big difference. Is objectivism is a comprehensive philosophy, and the conclusion that we come to as regards politics is different from some libertarians.
Yeah, I suppose I would say that from my point of view, just as like you said about how there are, anarchists who would call themselves objectivists, but that doesn't really seem to work in your mind on what objectivism really means. I would kind of say similar about libertarians who aren't, who are minarchists rather than anarchists with regards to their approach to government, because I feel like they make the same kind of error with regards to how consistent they are with the libertarian principles. I understand that it's not so much a contradiction for objectivists because self-ownership isn't the be-all and end-all for objectivists, but for libertarians, that is our foundational principle.
Well,
Sorry, go on.
No, I'm sorry, I interrupted. I go ahead. You can finish.
Well, no,
I
all I was
didn't.
going to
What?
all I was going to say is I don't want to be like you're not a true libertarian to everybody who's not an anarchist, but it's more of a case that I see that as an inconsistency. Just like, for example, I don't call Dave Smith not a libertarian because he's wrong on immigration, but I just cannot call that an area where he's wrong on that area. So it's an inconsistency. So for me, anarchists are just consistent libertarians, and minarchists or people or libertarians who still go for some flavor or size of government are just, for one of a better, for the risk of sounding like arrogant or whatever, but they're just wrong on that issue. They're not consistent with the libertarian principle.
Oh, I can understand that, but I would still say they're libertarians. The reason
Oh
is
yeah, yeah,
because with objectivism, this is a philosophy that was developed by one person. So that person defines what the philosophy entails. Whereas libertarianism, as a political philosophy, has been developed for hundreds of years from a vast array of thinkers, from John Locke, Frederick Bastiat, Lysander Spooner, Ludwig von Mises. So it's different in that sense, but you could certainly argue that they're inconsistent.
yeah. I mean, I suppose I kind of hold the principle for libertarianism where you might put Ayn Rand for objectivism. Like Ayn Rand says so, so that's what objectivism is, kind of thing, or that's where objectivism stands on this issue. I kind of take the same approach to the principle of, like the concept of individual self ownership and the non aggression principle, and obviously property rights that come from that. For me, that is the kind of Ayn Rand of libertarianism, if you like. That's the kind of the reference with regards to getting your correct answer, if you like. So
Sure. Now, just to clarify, so I don't be misunderstood, I am most certainly not saying because Ayn Rand said it, it's true. So what I'm saying is that Ayn Rand defines objectivism, and if there's errors in that, they're hers, but those errors are still a part of objectivism, right?
yeah,
It's not a matter of her being infallible or anything else. It's just that it's her philosophy.
sure, yeah. No, I understand. No, I understand that, and I'm just making the same point with regards
Yeah,
to the principle,
sure.
and because like you make the point that libertarianism doesn't belong to any one individual philosopher, but if there is any kind of defining center point of it, it would have to be the principle that some people interpret perhaps in different ways, but that's the kind of the thing that says what is libertarian, if you like. So yeah, that's kind of where I go from it. So I suppose with the with regards to the kind of government monopoly versus not, and the whole minarchism anarchism thing, it is really just a kind of case of, like I say, I'm not saying, oh, you're not a true libertarian. I just think they're wrong on that issue. They're just like, it's the same with libertarians. Like I say, some will hold different positions on immigration, but only one of those positions is actually correct to the libertarian principle. Same for IP, same for all the areas where libertarians disagree. There's still, for me, an objectively correct answer, at least according to the principle that we're espousing.
Sure. So you asked me about the culture of the way people disagree. Now, I've had interactions online with a lot of people, people that call themselves objectivists, people that call themselves libertarians, people that call themselves Marxists, and of course the MAGA folk. But with the MAGA folk, what I've found is we have people who call themselves objectivists but are aligned with MAGA. You have libertarians that align with MAGA. And these Marxists, they actually call themselves MAGA communists. And what I've noticed, and I don't think it's an accident, they all have horrible manners. Like, you're a jerk, and they, get be far more vile than that. And ultimately, it comes from top down. In that, people, I think, not that they weren't like that. I think that they feel like Trump gave them a license. The way that he acts, they mimic it. They probably always wanted to behave that way, but couldn't. And they bemoan cancel culture. And I'm not a fan of cancel culture, right? I don't want to cancel people for holding the wrong view. But opposition to cancel culture ought not to be a license to be a dick. right? And there's a meme that goes around, and I don't know if it's accurate or not, if Mike Tyson ever said it, but it certainly reveals a truth. He says people have gotten the internet has made people way too comfortable with saying things without being afraid to get punched in the face. And a lot of these people, like I've been called, you're a coward. And I'm just like, I'm not hiding behind a fake name. You have a pseudonym that you use to hide behind. And I don't care if you want to use a pseudonym online because of whatever. You don't want to be doxxed. You don't want people knowing your own business. I'm cool with that. But don't use that so that you could be a jerk to everybody because that's cowardly, right? If you want to be a tough guy, if you want to put yourself out there, then have the balls to be who you are. These communists that have now inundated my thread, they virtually all have fake names. And I asked one today, if you guys are so proud of being communists, why all the pseudonyms? But the Dave Smith libertarians, the MAGA objectivists, these are the people that tend to be rude. I don't know how else to put it, but I think that culturally, it's just not a good thing. I think that I can disagree with somebody. I disagree with you, but I don't then say I disagree with you as a person, like that I hate you. No, we disagree. We've come to different conclusions. So what? I mean, I'll fight against the implementation of the worldview that you want to put forward, and you'll fight against mine, but we can do it intellectually and with manners. It doesn't mean that I hate you and I have to now be a jerk to you and say all kinds of nasty things about you. But I really do. I just think that culture that we have now, and especially because I was in prison so long, so I came out to this and it's just like, wow. Oh my God, people are like this. It's just reprehensible. And the interesting thing is, people aren't like that when I go to the mall or when I go to a restaurant. They're like that when they're online. And I'm a big fan of the internet. I think it's great. I'm for freedom on the internet. And I'm not saying that there should be rules or rather laws against people acting like that. I just think that people should govern themselves better. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, we can still believe in people's freedom to act how they want without necessarily agreeing with every
Sure.
limit of how they would stretch that freedom. And yeah, and it is the problem. Some people just want to push the boundaries for the sake of it. Like you say, with things like count culture, they're thinking, okay, well, how offensive can we get to push that kind of thing? And the personality cult thing is a big issue as well because, and that's what I think it is. Like what you touched upon, I think a lot of it is just like a personality cult. You've got people that like if they're MAGA supporters, then they're just going to worship Trump and they're just going to throw poison or vitriol at anybody that they see as not fully aligning. I mean, you even see how they turn on each other. If one of them kind of is a supporter of his but disagrees on a particular issue, they
Right.
all pile on, you know what I mean? And it does get and like yeah, I get similar from some of Dave Smith's followers when I've reached out to him to try to debate him on, like, for example, the immigration issue, and I'll have a lot of, which isn't his fault, but I'll have a lot of his followers telling me, like, who are you? Why should he give you the time of day and all of that kind of thing.
Right. Well, I don't know if how much I agree with you that it's not
Okay.
his fault. And what I mean by that is this. Obviously, Dave's not responsible for anybody's behavior, just like I'm not and you're not. But we do cultivate the kind of audience that we get, right? And I know if I wanted to how to gain a big following. I know how to be a shock jock. I know how to communicate to get followers. You tell people what they want to hear. You do so with absolute certainty. You be willing to say, screw you to the people they don't like. But I'm not going to do that. Right? I like to have polite conversations. I like to discuss ideas. I like to debate ideas. That's the audience that I want, are people that are really interested in ideas that aren't interested in a food fight. So if you've got a line of followers that are just interested in a food fight, you're doing something to cultivate that.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a fair point. I just obviously don't want to hold him responsible for every
No, he's not.
idiot,
People are
you know what I mean?
responsible for
But
their
yeah,
own behavior. I'm just saying, but you're not blameless if you've got, especially if I'm looking at my thread and I see a bunch of my followers. And I've only got 2,000 of them. But if all of a sudden I see a bunch of them, if some guy comes in and just disagrees with me about anarchy, say, and they all start just insulting this guy, I'd say, hey, knock it off. You know what I mean? I wouldn't just think that's cool,
Yeah, yeah,
but
no.
he's okay with it.
Yeah, yeah. And to be honest, like you say, with like the whole Trump thing, I think he has made it kind of cool to be a jerk, kind of thing. And a lot
Sure.
of his follow, and that it does. I mean, it's a shame because I certainly take the approach which I've seen that you definitely take with regards to your approach, which is about just trying to have conversations with people. And the thing is I don't view, like there's obviously, I mean, even other libertarians, and when I'm speaking to them, there's obviously things that we talk about that we can agree on and we can explore that together. There's things that we disagree on and we can explore that together. And I find that someone who disagrees with me on something, rather than feeling like I need to kind of attack that person or something, I'd rather reach out to them and say, well, let's discuss why we disagree, because we probably won't change each other's minds, but at the very least, we might understand each other's arguments better, even if we can see why they're wrong or see how they're wrong. And sometimes, often I've had disagreements or debates with people where we haven't completely flipped each other, but we have at least located some kind of consensus between our positions, some kind of, okay, well, look, we do both agree on this and we found a common ground from it. So there's often been utility from it. And I just think that, I recently done a video for my channel called personality versus principle and policy, basically making the case that there's far too much focus on the former and not enough on the latter, too much
Right.
focus on personalities and whether someone's a dick or whether we like them or whatever. And I just think, well, look, we're all human beings, we're all imperfect. Some of us are acting in good faith, some of us are acting in bad faith. And I just feel like, well, I want to reach out to everybody that's acting in good faith, at least, even if I disagree with them, because, like I say, I can get value from the disagreements because I can learn about their perspective. I can maybe see where I'm wrong. I can maybe learn from that. I can maybe help them see where they're wrong. Or, like I say, we can both still hold our positions, but at least discover a consensus, through that good faith discussion. So, and also the other thing about it is, I often hear people talking about, like libertarians will say, oh, we need another Ron Paul. Not that he's gone, but he's obviously very old and past his most active sort of stage in his life. Or people say we need a Rothbard back, or like objectivists might say, oh, we need Ayn Rand back and all the rest of it. And I just feel like we need to do a little bit more about taking our focus away from people as like this personality cult of this person's going to save us or that person's going to save us, and really focus on the ideas and the policies that come from that are more likely to save us. You know what I mean? Like, so I really think that, sort of touching on your point about the discourse at the moment and the way how it is so toxic, is I think the antidote to that is to do what we're doing right now, which is have good faith discussions and reach out to people that do have the kind of good faith intentions. And again, we're not all on the exact same track and we're not all right and we're not all wrong, but I think we can all kind of get ourselves a little bit closer to truth and a little bit, and kind of reveal some kind of consensus that might help us move forward together. A big reason why I love to speak to objectivists is because they're so similar to libertarian. We've got so much crossover, so much areas of agreement, and the areas of disagreement don't necessarily need to undermine those, but sometimes those areas of disagreements can also help us as well, because we can explore why we come at those from slightly different angles, why we differ, and without even changing each other's minds. I mean, and sorry, I don't want to talk too much in one go, but it reminds me of a conversation I had with an objectivist, and you may not feel the same way as he did on this one, but we almost got to the point of like agreeing, because a lot of his arguments against sort of no government at all were kind of regards to the kind of chaos of anarchism and the kind of ANCAP society that someone like David Friedman might put forward, where you can have like NAP violations running rampant and it's all just about trade and enough property rights for capitalism, but not enough for libertarianism, which seems a weird kind of non-distinction. But I agreed, yeah, we need that order. I just didn't want to give, as I say, government monopoly. And that's my kind of resistance to the objectivist position. I don't want to give government anything, as a monopoly, even if it's something very specific and focused. But one of the areas where we did agree is, well, yeah, but I wouldn't oppose having a collective that did act like that without the monopoly. So, still, because a lot of the points that he made about why he did want a government to do that, and not leave it to the market, was he was worried about different laws being created, and having no coherence with regards to what law and crime even means, and all the rest of it. And I agreed that we do need that, and that's part of why I kind of, my Nation's a Sanity Project idea is to say, well, look, we do need to establish the non-aggression principle as the law, as the terms of peace. We do need to have that. We can't just say decentralize and everything's the market will take care of the rest, because it won't. And because the market, if it's not properly defined by freedom, the market could be slave trades and drug laws and all sorts of other abominations that don't comply with property rights, as either an objectivist or a libertarian would understand it. Sorry, I went on a bit there, but I got a thread.
I just want to back up a little bit
Yeah.
to David Friedman. David Friedman doesn't advocate for a ANCAP society that you can violate people's rights. What he says is there's no guarantee, and he's absolutely right, and there's no way around it, that if you have an ANCAP society, there's no guarantee that it's going to end up a free society. And that's warranted by history, in the case of Iceland, for instance. But I mean, it's also just logical that if people have no central government and they're free to interact and free to form their own groups, there's no guarantee that all those groups are going to, for instance, allow drug use or, allow pornography or prostitution or gambling. You don't know what's going to happen. What he would argue for is that none of those things are against the law in the ANCAP society. He just says that anybody basically that thinks that it's a magic bullet that you're going to have a free society is just mistaken. You don't know that.
Yeah, no, I understand, and yeah, and just to do away with any potential straw man of David Friedman's position, I'm not saying that he was advocating, for it to go that way. He's not, but what he was, but just to clarify his position, it's not the part that it's not a guarantee that I disagree with, because a law against rape doesn't guarantee that no one will rape, but it does say that it's not a legitimate part of of the society that you're advocating for. And my problem with David Friedman's conceptualization of anarcho-capitalism, and I debated with him on this issue, is that he says that an ANCAP society doesn't have to be definitionally libertarian. So, like, for example, if there was slave trade and if there was drug laws and all these things that would make it not a libertarian society, he said it would still be an ANCAP society. And my point is for me, an ANCAP society and a free society are the same things. And if it's not meeting the criteria of a free society, it's not meeting the criteria of an ANCAP society. My kind of argument on that is,
well, when you say ANCAP society, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, there's two parts, isn't there? There's the anarcho part, the anarchist part, and then there's the capitalist part. And both elements of that are being violated in the same, like if you're violating it so it's not a libertarian society, in which you're violating the non-aggression principle and self-ownership and all the rest of it, then I don't see that also how that doesn't also disqualify it as an anarchist society, if we're talking libertarian anarchist, which ANCAP supposedly is. And then the capitalist element of the ANCAP word is obviously emphasizing, like property rights and the implied free trade that goes along with that. So it's like, which is just another kind of angle of the same thing, of that same freedom. So for me, anarcho-capitalism, voluntarism, libertarianism, a free society, it's all just different words for the same thing. So for me, if like it's not about them not happening, it's about them being legitimate. You know what I mean? Like,
But he doesn't think they are. He doesn't think they would be good. He said he would advocate against them. I guess it comes down to it's a definitional thing. What do you mean by the words you're using? And so what you're saying, I think, is that if it did devolve into a situation where people weren't free, it would no longer be an anarchic capitalist society. But I don't think I think that he would agree that it might, just because you have done away with centralized government and you've done away with government doesn't mean that you can't have a situation where you have these defense organizations prop up, and some of them might not be free. So, and you would then say, well, they're not anarcho-capitalist. And I mean, that's fair. I'm not going to quibble about that. But the key point is that there's no guarantee once you decentralize that you're going to end up with a free society. And that's all I think he means. I'm not speaking for him on that because I've never actually discussed that particular point with him.
Yeah.
Just I know what he advocates and I know what he doesn't. And he certainly doesn't advocate for a system where you wouldn't be free.
Oh no, no. And again, I'm not saying he advocates it. When I say legitimate, I didn't mean he was thinking it morally legitimate, but just as in he wasn't saying it disqualified it as an anarcho-capitalist society, whereas he was saying it would disqualify it as a libertarian society. And my point is, if it disqualifies it for one, it surely disqualifies it for
Yeah,
the other. And if he doesn't take that view, then I'm struggling to understand what his definition of anarcho-capitalism is. Is it just enough decentralization so there's no central government? You know what I mean? It's kind of like, and that's when it gets into the point where I'm like, well, I'm not advocating for that if that's what ANCAP is. You know what I mean? It's kind of like I want the freedom aspect, the libertarian aspect,
sure.
and that's where I kind of unite a little bit with some objectivists against some so-called ANCAPs with regards to the kind of allowing for things like that. Like it's not so much that they can't guarantee it won't happen. It's just the fact that they're at least allowing for it within the definition of what it is they're advocating for. Like for example, I said, I made the point like, well, what is anarcho-capitalism if it's not complete decentralization and property rights? Not like I say, not a guarantee that those things won't be violated, but at least that's the thing. Because otherwise, you could have an anarcho-capitalist society that becomes communism. But what point did it not become anarcho-capitalist anymore?
Sure.
If you don't have that. If property rights isn't defining it, then what is I suppose is my point. And that's kind of my point with the whole libertarian thing about saying, we need to make the NAP the defining terms of peace, the kind of law, if you like, because if you don't have that, if it's just, let people do what they want, including violate the principle that determines they should do what they want, it's like, well, no, that's contradicting itself. It needs to be the freedom as defined by that principle. And we can't allow anything else that violates that to be considered legitimate. That's why I oppose kind of these versions of ANCAP. I oppose Hoppes' version of ANCAP, where he uses to justify his policy on immigration, where he thinks that we can just, take over all the commons, privatize everything, and not allow anyone to move anywhere outside their own property without getting some kind of permission from all the other property owners around them, or create quasi border walls around countries and stuff like that. And I disagree with David Friedman's version, where it's like, well, ANCAP can be as anything as people trading, even if they're trading in a way that violates the property rights that they are trading. It's, what I mean? It's like there's a self-contradiction there with the property rights that we're invoking for what anarcho-capitalism is supposed to mean in the first place. Does that make sense?
It does. It just depends on what you mean by anarcho-capitalism. That's what it boils down to. What exactly do you mean?
Yeah.
And you're saying by definition, anything that's not respecting property rights and having liberty, it wouldn't be anarcho-capitalism. I don't know. You'd have to, I mean, I don't know what he would say to that.
Well, I mean, we had a debate, and I'm not. Yeah, we don't need to do it by proxy, repeat it by proxy here. I mean, I'll put the link for anyone who wants to check that out as well. And to be honest, you should check it out if you've not covered this issue with him. You might be interested on kind of where we kind of go on it. But yeah, but that was the crux of it, and that's my kind of issue with some other ANCAPs or libertarians. That's kind of the one area, if you like, that they differ. You know what I mean? Because it's not just about, I mean, me and you having a conversation isn't just about a libertarian and an objectivist having a conversation. It's about Michael Liebowitz and his particular
Sure.
perspective, which is focused on objectivism, and my particular perspective, which is focused on libertarian. But as I say, like, there's obviously areas where we disagree, but our disagreements might not be exactly the same as every other libertarian that you encounter, because some of them, like I say, might be preaching from the Hop book or preaching from the David Friedman book. And depending on what element of that book you're looking at, I might have more in common with an objectivist on a certain issue, certainly with regards to the issue of law, and having this objective law. I feel like I kind of get a lot of kind of common ground with a lot of objectivists. In fact, I'd be interested to hear whether I've got similar common ground with you on that point with regards to needing that kind of law, and that objective law, which I think the NAP pretty much
Do
embodies.
I think that objective law is required
Yeah,
in society?
yeah,
I do, and that's why I think you and anarcho-capitalism would inevitably fail. is for that very reason. That's why I think you need a government that's going to have a monopoly on force in a given geographic area, because otherwise you have competing systems of law, and you don't have objective law. Whether you call it anarcho-capitalism or not, what I think it devolves to becomes a system that is much the one that David Friedman says is possible. Now, that's not to say that I'm saying that, well, if you just have a constitutional government like the one I advocate, you're going to be fine, because ultimately that's history hasn't demonstrated that. Obviously, the things can devolve, and I've made this point with everybody I've ever debated on this issue. You're never going to enact, either of us, the kind of system that we want unless people want it, right? If people don't want it, you're not going to get it. So you have to convince enough people. Now, the problem is, if you convince, let's say I'm in Connecticut right now. So if, say, you convince 65% of Connecticut that you want to have a minarchist government that protects rights and is funded by voluntary contributions and a lottery, right? You could do that even though you had another 35% that was opposed to it. Now, suppose you have the same thing. Suppose 65% of the people in a given geographic area want anarcho-capitalism. The other 35% don't. So you invoke anarcho-capitalism and you want to hold it based on the freedom perspective. But now those other 35 people can just start their own organization. It's going to cross over geographic boundaries, because you have a house here, a restaurant, whatever, and they don't all have the same system. So now they can implement their own system within that territory that's not conducive to the one that you have. And when you end up in conflict with them, who resolves it? And the idea that's put forth by Friedman puts it forward, and others, well, you're going to have courts and arbitration. Some people just won't agree. Like I told Mike Humer, when I was a criminal, if you gave me the option, screw you and your court, right? I'm not going to your court. I'm never going to accept its verdict. And if you say, well, I would have to have an agency that does that, that has already entered agreement. What if I don't have an agency? You're eventually going to have a verdict on me against my will, no matter what, and rightly so, right? But so how isn't that the initiation of force before I've been convicted of a crime to bring me into a court of law, try me, and send me to jail? I don't think it is an initiation of force, right? But if you're going to be as strict and hold to the NAP in this rationalistic context, where anytime somebody doesn't consent, you're violating it, well, then yes, you're violating it. You're violating it just in the same way as they claim that the minarchist government that I advocate is violating it by not allowing the development of all these competing agencies.
But what do you say to that charge, though, about the, because that's one contradiction that I'm keen to know what you think about with regards to, because do you concede that it is a violation? There is a contradiction.
No, I don't, because I don't hold to metaphysical, out of context absolutes, right? And I ultimately don't care. If you want to say it is, okay, if it is. It doesn't really matter to me. The purpose that we're trying to establish is to render rights secure, right? So somebody might say to me, well, you're saying you want to violate rights for the sake of upholding rights. But I think, and I think far more accurately, I could just as easily say, well, you want to prevent the government from initiating force in order so that no other rights can be secure, because that's what I ultimately think is going to happen. I think if you have a legitimate threat, right, a legitimate risk, I don't believe if you can argue, and it ultimately is going to come down to semantics, initiation of force. If I know you're coming down the street and you have a knife and I know you're going to stab me and I hit you first, somebody can say, well, you've initiated force against him. Well, no, the threat was there. It's like I told Dr. Block, well, are you for letting people have nuclear weapons in their backyard? No, because the threat is too high. So you have to accept then the threat principle. And if you accept the threat principle, my argument is that there's no way rights can be secure under an ANCAP society. The threat is that high that it justifies the use of force. And it's the same with the nuclear weapon in your backyard. It's the same with driving while you're intoxicated. You know, I've driven drunk probably 100 times in my life and never crashed. But getting behind the wheel of an automobile when you're hammered is putting other people at risk. To enough where I think it justifies rendering it illegal.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that sometimes the non-aggression principle, fun enough, when I started my Nations of Sanity project, I really focused on saying we need to make the NAP the law, we need to make the non-aggression principle the law. And then I kind of changed my language a bit. And although I still say that, I kind of focus more on saying we need to define the law by the concept of individual self-ownership. Now, even though I'm kind of saying the same thing, I really kind of focus it on the individual self-ownership thing, because the non-aggression principle just comes, it's just the principle that comes from that concept, you know, like if we agree that everyone has right over themselves and owns themselves, then the non-aggression principle is kind of, you know, well, that's implied by that. But rather than, I agree with you that we have the right to, you know, preemptively act against threats of aggression. We don't. It doesn't have to wait till after the fact or the very moment or whatever. But the reason why I feel that's justified is because that's still in service of protecting the individual rights of self-ownership. So it's not a violation of the non-aggression principle because you're not initiating force against a peaceful person. You could argue someone you're initiating force against someone who's initiating force against you through the threat of it.
But
So
then it wouldn't be initiating. I mean,
yeah,
again, that's one of these things where it might come down to semantics,
yeah,
and I don't really care,
yeah,
right? What I care about is living in a free society where rights are protected. And if you're in your house and you see a bunch of people across the street from you, and they're clearly planning to rob your house, they're gathering up all the materials, you know, they're not even trying to really hide it, although they haven't specifically said, "I'm coming to rob your house," and you call the police, I don't think it's an initiation of force for the police to come and apprehend them, right? Because it's clear what's going on.
yeah,
And
yeah.
to me, it's clear as day that you're necessarily, in the same way that Mises argued that socialism is impossible because of the economic calculation problem, I would argue that anarcho-capitalism is impossible as far as rights go because of the economic problems involved. You simply, like David Friedman, I think it might even have been Walter Block said to me, well, that would be an outlaw court. Well, but then you're going that for instance, if you had a bunch of criminals that got together and formed their own organization and they said this is ours and we're not going to arbitrate with you, he says, well, that would be an outlaw court. Well, okay, but now you're saying that you can go use force against them. You can force them to deal with you. You're just drawing the line at a different place from where I'm drawing it. But you're not upholding this strict, thou shalt not initiate force, right? I don't believe in commandments. These aren't God-given rules that we have to, out of context, obey, right? I mean, the whole purpose of these are to allow human beings to flourish. That's why we have rights. And if you're creating a situation where I can't flourish, then I've got the right to do something to stop that.
Yeah, I understand that, and the funny thing is like, and this is why I kind of want to distinguish my version of ANCAP. That's why, like, it's not an unimportant distinction. So I'm just going to turn my phone off that keeps beeping at me. It's not an unimportant distinction. My difference with or how I conceptualize a free society, as I would call it, and someone like David Friedman or Hop or any of these a lot of these other people that would say this is what ANCAP is, because I do agree with a lot of the points you've made with regards to the need for that kind of law and order, but I suppose the way from my perspective, I'm kind of standing a little bit in between, say, your position and say David Friedman's position by saying, okay, well, we need the law and order, but we can't have this monopoly on force. So, like, I agree with you that we can't have a market on making laws. Like, that can't be a free market thing. But I disagree with you that that can be a government monopoly thing. I think the law needs to be defined by the principle objectively. And I'm quite happy to have market competition with regards to the enforcement of it, even though I personally would support something more centralized and collective that would perhaps be more akin to an objectivist government, if you like. But the one area where I would part company with objectivists is on the monopoly issue. That's the snag for me. Is I'm happy to have this objective law. I'm happy to make sure that everyone there's not market for that. That's just set. But I'm not happy for having one, because the other problem as well with this government is, do they their monopoly on enforcing the law can very quickly turn into a monopoly on creating it as well, and the same dangers that come from this kind of the things you mentioned with
Sure.
David Friedman's approach. They can kind of spur up, and some of the greatest injustices we see today come from that monopoly enforced. When you think of like qualified immunity, prosecutorial immunity, and all those sort of things
Well,
that give
see, I would
government.
disagree.
Okay, go on.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt.
No, no,
I just
please.
wanted to say I disagree with that. You can keep going. I just wanted to render my disagreement for the
Oh,
record.
okay. Okay. Well, I was nearly finished anyway. But yeah, that's basically my point. I do think a lot of the problems I think you rightly, that's the thing. I think you rightly identify a lot of problems with a lot of conceptualizations of anarcho-capitalism that I don't particularly share. But like I say, my version involves establishing the non-aggression principle as the terms of peace, then allowing a free market with regards to different enforcement agencies. But what the law is set in stone, so to speak. And I just worry that a lot of the things that you worry about with regards to the free market approach is perhaps a potentially bigger danger with allowing any entity, government or call it whatever, having that monopoly, because that's where that extra power, power corrupts and what have you. So sorry, go on.
So the problem is the predominant philosophy in a given culture, right? Governments, unless the government is just, conquering and killing, which we don't really have here in America, um, on our own soil, anyways, is that people accept that. People want Social Security, people want Medicare, Medicaid, they want SNAP, they want the government to build roads, they want the government to enforce all, drug laws, that sort of thing. The only way to implement a free society is if people want it. And if you had people wanting it, then the government is not incentivized to go beyond what the people want, right? So the whole thing is contingent. And I agree that's a problem and it's a difficulty, but it's no less a difficulty for anarcho-capitalism. It probably is more of a difficulty because at least people are nominally aware of what limited constitutional government is, right? People, I think, would flip out about the idea of anarcho-capitalism. Doesn't mean it's wrong. I'm just saying it's what most people would think. And so to convince them of it would be a harder step than to convince them of a constitutional republic or a constitutionally limited government. So the issue I have is you talk about the subjective law, but if you have different protection agencies and there's no overarching one to enforce the objective law, then there's no guarantee. And in fact, I would say there's a guarantee that some of them are going to stray from it because there's going to be a demand for it. And I can give you, I mean, even amongst libertarians, you have disagreements about intellectual property, right? So if you are going to one of these rights protection agencies and you say, okay, I want my rights protected, what are the services you offer? You want an agency that's going to protect your intellectual property because you believe in intellectual property and you're a creator. But you have another guy who's also a libertarian. He doesn't believe in it. So he's not going to sign up for that agency. He's going to sign up for the agency that doesn't believe in intellectual property. He steals your stuff that you think is intellectual property and he doesn't. How do you resolve it? And Friedman told me, well, they would go to an arbitrator. Why? Why would this organization that I've hired to protect my rights, amongst which is intellectual property, agree to go to an arbitrator who's going to decide based on a different set of criteria? If you have competition, the agencies want to defend their customers to the max, right? And if you're just going to sell me out to a court, I'm not hiring you. I'm going to find the agency that's going to protect me. And you have a problem. And I brought up a similar example with the age of consent laws. If I've got if I sign up for an agency that says the age of consent is 16, you have one that says it's 18. My son, my 18-year-old son dates your 16-year-old daughter. They have sex. You go to your agency and say, hey, my daughter's been raped, right? Go apprehend this son of a bitch. And I tell, well, wait a second. My agency says the age is 16. You're violating my son's rights. You're initiating force against him. Who's the independent decider? It can't just be some arbiter that doesn't have a set of pre-existing laws, because if we don't have pre-existing laws, we don't know how to act. And that situation is inevitable because people disagree about that. Whereas if you had one government, you might have people disagree, but there's issues on the margin like the age of consent, like IP, where ultimately it's going to be decided by a majority. And then you would know ahead of time what the law is, whether IP is protected, whether it's not. You would have a government that's ultimately going to decide based on that criteria. And you might have people that are upset, whatever, but you wouldn't have the lack of the monopoly that could enforce the law, whatever it happens to be. If it were just as clear cut as this is the correct law, everybody's going to agree to it, then yes, of course, you could have whatever you wanted. The problem is people disagree. Even smart people, even principled people who share the same fundamental principle will disagree in its application. And you need to have an arbiter that's going to decide that. And you can't just leave that up to competition in a market.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to sort of clarify where I agree and where I disagree here, because there's a lot of areas where I do wholeheartedly agree with you. I mean, in fact, I wrote what you said about the requirement for pre-existing laws, and I circled that as our big common ground, because I'm 100% agree with you. We need the pre-existing laws, and as I say, to clarify my distinction between me or my ANCAP and the ANCAP of someone like David Friedman, is there's no competition for creating laws. So there's no I forgot what we called them, rights enforcement agencies or whatever the agencies courts were. There's none of those that are saying that that are saying, oh well, we're deciding that this is how IP is, or we're deciding how that is IP is. There's a very objective way on how IP is according to the principle, and that's what can be enforced as law. Anything else would have to be part of some kind of because we can still have. Let's have a point that's worth making is collectives can still have rules between themselves. You know what I mean? Like that aren't laws imposed on everybody else. But when it comes to the laws that we can impose on everybody else, justifiably against their will with force, then we're talking about really only protecting individual rights, self-ownership, what we would call defensive force, or enforcing the non-aggression principle. So I agree with you on that. Think something like like IP, as I say, although I know you're on a different side to me on that, I don't think that's a grey area issue. I think IP is very black and white.
Well, I'm not going to agree to it. And if I have a competing defense agency, I'm not hiring one that's going to agree with it. And on the flip side, Stefan Kinsella is never going to, if he's given the choice, he's never going to allow for this to be decided by some independent person. He thinks that he absolutely adamantly opposes IP, and that's all there is to it. I absolutely think IP is legitimate. So why? And now you say there's going to be this law, but as much like Rothbard talks about, they're going to be operating according to libertarian law. Well, who's enforcing that? It's in the sky, and we have to go by it. Oh, libertarian law. No, you're talking about real human beings making real decisions, and you're talking about nobody has a monopoly on force. I'm going to pick the defense agency who's going to defend my intellectual property. I'm not going to hedge on that. I'm not going to equivocate. And there's a lot of other people that aren't either. And how do you resolve that in this situation?
Okay, imagine this scenario then. There's a little thought experiment I'd like to run by you, because I don't think we've got time to debate IP
No, I've only got
specifically.
a few more minutes. I've got to
Yes,
get
yeah,
going by
yeah.
5.
I know we need to wrap up. So, but I just want to run this like thought experiment by you to kind of sum up where I think there's things for you to consider here. In America, and neither of us are fully in agreement with the American Constitution, but there's obviously a lot of good about it, and a lot of things that unfortunately get violated by the government. Imagine America had the Constitution written as it is, but instead of having a government with a monopoly on force to, enforce that constitution, you had this kind of, so a little bit like what I'm talking about. You don't have the David Friedman scenario of everyone can make their own laws. They've got to follow the constitution, but there is that competing competition for who enforces it or whatever. Do you think that the constitution and the freedoms that would be acted under it would be in a worse or better condition today if it was with the constitution, but the free market enforcement of it, as opposed to this monopoly
Oh,
government?
it would be incredibly worse. I mean, just look, how often do cases go all the way to the Supreme Court and get decided there where they've had disagreements on the lower courts and one court overturns the next? You're talking about a situation where you have a constitution which sometimes isn't clear on its meaning and different people interpret it differently. And there's no final arbiter in the situation that you're talking about. And also, I mean, you have it, it's out there, okay. In my community, we don't want to go by it. There's 50 people in my neighborhood, 37 don't want to go by it. Screw the other 13. They can move if they want, I suppose, if they can afford it, but what if they can't? Unless you have the final arbiter, and Rothbard himself says it has to end somewhere. Well, why? Because you say so? If you don't have a final arbiter, then where do these cases end? How do they stop? Because again, if we take it back to the criminal law, at what point do you think I'm going to stop appealing if my freedom's on the line and I'm going to say, you know what, you're right. I'm going to keep, no, I don't accept your verdict. No way. You have no right to try me. I haven't consented to your jurisdiction. I haven't consented to your authority. You're not going to keep trying me and you're going to insist, oh, yes, we are. And there's just no way around that.
But do you not also look at how much of the government that exists today is a direct violation of that constitution? Like how much of its
Yeah,
agents?
of
Do you
course,
see what
of
I mean, though?
course.
So, like
I do. Yeah.
I
I'm not
mean,
optimistic about any of this actually taking place. You know what
sure.
I mean? It's a tough fight to make because even with it, like if you think about all the people that say advocate for individual rights, libertarians, objectivists, amongst between libertarian and objectivists, there's a massive amount of disagreement. Amongst people who call themselves subjectivists, there's a massive amount of disagreement. Amongst libertarians, there's even more disagreement. So you're talking about even if you consolidated us all, we'd be a very small percentage of the country. But then when you think about the actual makeup, the internal makeup, it's non-existent. So I'm not optimistic by any stretch of the imagination. I think it's worth fighting for, and I think these arguments are worth making. But ultimately, we're at a very theoretical level when we're discussing this stuff. Um, I don't think it's I don't even like that I use the term theoretical in that way because I believe we're talking about things that can be implemented concretely. And I believe that there's things right now that we can advocate that are plausible within the framework that we're talking. And I think we should advocate those things and not just say, well, no, I'm not going to play. I'm not going to play this game. I don't think we should do that. Like we can, for instance, advocate for the complete legalization of marijuana. I think that's a viable thing to argue for, or a reduction in taxes, more, deregulation. So we can still take the broad theoretical principles we're talking to and apply them to the concrete situation we have today. But when we get into the purity of what we would actually want, that's a very, very long march and a very difficult one.
Still, I think it's one worth pursuing.
Sure,
I
I do
think we can
too.
achieve
I
a
do
lot.
too. I mean, either way, I've got about 30 years left on the planet, right? I might as well spend them fighting for what I believe.
I agree, and I think as well. I think the more we can do to illuminate our North Star, even if we'll never get fully there, we can take the better steps in that direction by you know by illuminating it more and more. And I think we do that through these
Sure,
sort of discussions. So I think I'll probably
sure.
wrap it up on that note.
That works for me.
Great
I mean,
conversation. Sorry,
thank you
go.
so much. And you have a great night.
And you too, Michael. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, buddy. Take care.